היי, מה שלומך תיכונת? אצלי הכל דליקטסים, והרגל שלי על הברקסים, ויש לי שפם.
Welcome back to The Place of Places, a chapter-by-chapter analysis of William Saroyan's 1972 memoir, Places Where I've Done Time. Today, we check out Chapter 21, The Bahai Temple, Haifa, 1961. This chapter has a different vibe from many of the others. It's more vulnerable and more analytical than many of the others. There's some interesting name-dropping here. He begins with a story about a party he attended with other writers in 1944, in which Hemingway is dominating the conversation and accuses the host of being a, quote, fairy, while Hungarian writer Arthur Koestler looks on adoringly. This is no big revelation for anyone who is familiar with Hemingway's brash attitude and hypermasculine behaviors. And even though Saroyan and Hemingway had a public feud in the 30s that was followed by a détente, it seems that Saroyan still, throughout the 20th century, felt Hemingway was a bit of a jerk. He accuses all of them, Hemingway, Koestler, and the unnamed host, of being snobs. Saroyan never really liked to be among his own in this regard, having some trouble relating to other writers and often looking at them as an outsider might. He tended more towards painters and musicians. The war years were filled with these types of macho writers acting overly masculine while having fragile egos. In the 1940s, Saroyan didn't appear so different from them in some respects. In fact, much of his writing has the classic Mary Magdalene versus Madonna trope that fills Western literature. That is, his female characters are either whores or virgins. In the case of Saroyan's works, there are literally whores in his stories, though the trope can just refer to sexualized women. And to represent the doting virgins are his sisters, mother, anyone female in the family. So with his drinking, gambling, and whoring, he probably got on superficially well with Hemingway in person. But he also wasn't a hypocrite, and he watched all these backstabbing male writers in mutual admiration and felt disgust. By 1944, Hemingway was a legend. He was only 10 years older than Saroyan, but was the appointed star of every gathering. Today, the party Saroyan attended might be described as full of bros. As Saroyan watches them fawn over each other while acting homophobic, he writes, "What was the matter with these writers? Heterosexual, homosexual, bisexual, non-sexual, or whatever the hell they might be. Why were they such horses' asses?" Saroyan made his career on writing sympathetically about all types of people, especially those ignored or disenfranchised by the dominant culture. And then he was with these writers, able to make a difference, claiming that the writer must know everything and not merely be a writer, and at the same time volleying sarcastic barbs at each other like children. And Saroyan tells us, the scene changed. Everybody went home. I went home. It wasn't home. I didn't know whether I was going or coming. I couldn't write. I couldn't think. As we've discussed before, the war psychologically damaged him, and that trauma marked the beginning of the end of his success, though he continued to write until his death. As the world came out of the war's fever, everyone had to move on, to adapt or die. Those macho writers were to be replaced by the skinny beatniks, some of whom were openly gay. So this is the backdrop for where this chapter moves. Saroyan is struggling, disintegrating, his marriage failing, and his life and career falling apart. He reads an article by that familiar writer, Koestler, about Israel, and Saroyan is intrigued. A little background about Koestler. He was a Hungarian Jew born to a wealthy family that lost out in the various European conflicts. He at first supported Marxism and then condemned it as Stalinism took over. In the 1920s, he first went to Palestine and became a journalist, but he didn't fit into the culture there and left by 1930. He was taken prisoner in Spain for his anti-Franco sentiments and condemned to death before his life was traded to Britain. In France in 1939, he was held in a detention center as an undesirable alien, and like Hemingway, he was a known womanizer. He did find his way back to Palestine, and then it became Israel. Though he was a Zionist, he never fit comfortably in Israeli society, and mostly lived in Europe. He wrote in the late 1940s, quote, "Israel is both a hard pioneer country and a bitter refugee country, disillusioned by experience, stubbornly fighting for life, with an aching void in its past and an interrogation mark for its future." And Saroyan says, "Apparently, unintentionally, he made Israel seem to be the scene of the hope of the world. And so one year, by that time divorced, broke up the creek, damaged beyond repair by the war, the army, the unfortunate marriage, desperation, impulsiveness, gambling, drinking, I decided to visit Israel too." He lands in Haifa and finds there a Bahai temple. A very nice religion, without much of an image, with no hero, or at any rate no hysterical hero. No big showbiz trial, no fancy parables, no crucifixion, just a man who sincerely believed there was a nice way for everybody to live. In Akko, there's a shrine to the founder of Bahai, where he died in 1892. Saroyan calls it a cult. It is a relatively new religion, having been founded in the 19th century, and it teaches the unification of the world and its religions, something that seems up Saroyan's alley. Though his father was a minister, Saroyan never much practiced religion and often openly disparaged it. But spirituality was interesting to him, and much of his work draws on this sense of being one with the divine, without the trappings of religious rites. By 1961, he needed a win and some peace. The Bahai Temple offered that, but he also describes it as being run by gentle losers, the caretakers from Berkeley, which must have amused Saroyan. Did he find peace there? He found beautiful gardens. It was all hopeless and sad, while Israel was all business, but probably not quite the hope of the world. This chapter obviously makes literal connections between meeting Arthur Koestler in 44 and being inspired to go to Israel by Koestler in 61. He also links these stories with the concept of hope versus reality. In the case of the deluded writers, they felt they needed to be the hope of the world, and Saroyan scoffs at their snobbery and hypocrisy. And though he wanted to believe Israel might be the hope of the world, he finds that it too is just part of the business of world, another presence trying to build itself into a success, just like the writers. For those who just wanted to exist peacefully, the Bahai, Saroyan sees the world absorbing them and their eventual failure. Saroyan's lack of motivation lasted years, as shown in this 1963 journal entry. He says, "Backwards, oh backwards, and nowhere in time. For years I have had this nagging feeling that I am not functioning fully, not giving my energy and time and thought to worthy activities, not working right, not accomplishing that which is right for me to accomplish, not moving forward or outward into a form which might be said to be a true human form. A life that is, and this damned feeling is intense right now." It's a dreary chapter, but one that offers much insight into the second half of Saroyan's career. Like most of the chapters, it reads like a casual conversation he's having with the reader, where one thought leads to the next, and in that way feels very authentic, vulnerable, and uncensored. But Saroyan was a master of this type of writing, and held his cards close to his chest when it came to his true feelings and values. Yet, it is this type of intimacy, real or not, that readers always responded to, and what made him stand out in a crowded field of writers. Even today, Saroyan's persona of embracing all races, ethnicities, orientations, is still a progressive stance, and stands the test of time. But even his biographers, who lovingly research him, have often found that the man himself held contradictory views. Saroyan was nothing if not admittedly human and flawed. Regardless, this is a chapter that illustrates late-stage Saroyan-esque style, where he still uses gentle humor and poetic choices, but it's no longer so innocent, so optimistic, or so fast-paced. Let's put this on the Saroyan map and move on.